Okay. A little bit of a slight starting issues. But that's fine. That'll be fine. That'll be fine. That will be fine. Okay, still trying to figure this out. Okay. I won't it let me go in. I won't it let me go in. I won't it let me go. Okay, there we go. I won't it let me go in. I won't it let me go. Okay, there we go. Things are mostly working. I won't it let me go in. I won't it. Okay, there we go. Things are mostly okay. There we go.
Zodiac Killer would hold them at gunpoint and eventually tie them up with plastic clothesline. He would make Cecilia tie up Brian, and Brian, being extremely smart, would make the knots seem like they were tighter than they were when Cecilia actually tied them pretty loose. And the Zodiac Killer would tie up Cecilia himself with knots that were horrifically tight. And Brian would whisper to Cecilia that he thought he could get a hold of the Zodiac Killer's gun. But she would respond in complete and utter fear, which absolutely, like being in that situation, a lot of people, I assume, would just want to be agreeable with the killer. So she was scared that if he did that, they would both get killed. So he decided to go back on that plan. And then, without any warning at all, the Zodiac Killer would begin his brutal attack, stabbing Brian 6 times in the back, one of which would go through his lung, and Cecilia would get stabbed 10 times, both in the front and in the back, using a knife with a blade nearly a foot long. And as the Zodiac Killer would walk away, he would leave a very disturbing message on the car of Brian's white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia. and it would bear the dates of his previous attack with the same circle cross signature, which in my opinion is very obvious that he just wants to take credit for those attacks and make sure that the police know that this is done by the same killer. So he just wants credit where credit's due, basically, in a really dumb way. And like I said before, the couple were in a very remote area at a kind of a weird time, so they didn't see any other people there besides the Zodiac Killer, so the odds of somebody coming by to find them were very, very slim. But thankfully, a fisherman would hear them screaming and would alert the park rangers. And by the time help had arrived, the two had freed themselves, but both victims would be in critical condition, obviously being stabbed so many times. And the ambulance wouldn't arrive until an hour later after being found. So Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell would be taken to the hospital immediately, but unfortunately Cecilia would succumb to her injuries and pass away in less than 48 hours after the attack. Although Brian would survive, which is how we know about all of the details of the attack and what the Zodiac's appearance was, and the fact that the knife looked homemade almost, according to the police report. And while in the hospital, Brian would be interviewed, giving us the insight into the mind of someone who believed themselves to be dying.
At the beginning, I didn't think I was going to die. And so from that moment on, one has to have certain goals that you have to set. The first goal, of course, was to live. I suppose the second goal was to get untied. The next one was to get help, and getting help, getting to the hospital. You know, you have to have a successive set of goals. And if you can keep this going, and you can keep your mind active, I don't, whether you die or not, you're at least psychologically attuned, whether you're in shock or not. If you can keep arguing with yourself, praying, doing anything, keep your mind off of yourself, or at least just not laughing back and just saying, well, it's no use.
And you can just tell in that interview that he's just such a well-spoken, smart man, and it's so sad what happened to him and his friend Cecilia, and my heart goes out to the families and victims, obviously, and to the Zodiac Killer, but we'll get back to it. And at 7:40 p.m., just over an hour after the attack, the Napa County Police Department would receive a chilling call. In a calm, emotionless voice, the caller reported,
"I wanted to report the murder. No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of our headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carbon Kia."
And before hanging up, the caller would claim,
"I'm the one who did it."
and this call, paired with the writing on the doors of the car, would confirm that this was a genuine Zodiac Killer attack. And the police would trace that phone call to a phone booth in Napa downtown, where they would find fingerprints that they hoped would lead to the Zodiac Killer, but unfortunately it did not. And Cecilia's death would be extremely widely mourned, and her funeral would draw a crowd of those grieving the losses of other victims of the Zodiac Killer. Her funeral procession was over 50 cars long, and because Brian survived, and even though the Zodiac Killer was hooded at the time, Brian was able to give a description based upon what he could see. He would describe the killer as a white male between 5'8" and 6 foot, with dark brown hair and a heavy-set build. And other clues were found, but they offered no clear path to his identity. The police would find a size 10.5 wing walker shoe print and tire tracks at the scene, suggesting a methodical, cold-blooded predator who enjoyed taunting his pursuers. And though these 3 attacks show a calculating mind, and the use of a costume obviously indicates some amount of forethought being put into these attacks, Brian Hartnell, who was in his hospital bed, didn't believe that this man was fully aware of what he was doing. And this attack would add another layer to the Zodiac's terrifying persona. No longer content with just simple murder, he now introduced bizarre elements to his crimes, leaving both the investigators and the public in a state of shock and confusion. And one thing that's interesting is the close proximity in time between the second attack and the third attack. The murders of both the couples before the third attack had been in relative close proximity to each other, near Vallejo and Benicia, but this time it was different. This third attack would transpire quite a ways north in Napa Valley on Lake Berryessa. And could this large distance have contributed to the Zodiac Killer not waiting as long before attacking again, potentially thinking himself safe to attack sooner in an area people may be less vigilant? Maybe. Was his hunger for killing getting stronger as he kept getting away with it? Possibly. It would seem that this would become a pattern, as exactly 2 weeks later, the Zodiac Killer would attack again in the heart of San Francisco, which brings us to attack number 4. Paul Stine was a part-time insurance agent and a student at San Francisco State College who was working on the night of October 11th, 1969, and he was working a late-night shift as a taxi driver, which he did to pay his way through college. And this night, his final fare would be hailed at the theater in between the intersection where Geary Street meets Mason and where Geary meets Powell. And the destination for this fare was Presidio Heights, an affluent neighborhood known for its tranquil streets and upscale homes, though the tranquility of this night would be short-lived. The corner of Washington and Maple Street were intended for this person's drop-off, but the journey would end a block away at Washington and Cherry Streets. The trip would end at roughly 9:55 p.m. when Paul was shot in the head at point-blank range. The firearm that was used was a 9mm semi-automatic, which was not the same gun used at the attack in Blue Rock Springs Park. And this gunshot would be extremely loud, so a gunshot in this affluent community would probably not go unnoticed. So across the street, 3 young individuals would witness this attack from about 60 feet away and watch the following actions of the Zodiac Killer. They would watch the Zodiac Killer go through Stine's belongings in the front seat and then would wipe down the cab with what appeared to be a cloth, like wiping away fingerprints. Maybe, possibly, probably, most likely, I think. So the police would obviously be quickly called, and the Zodiac Killer would not be masked at this point either. They were able to see very clearly the man who eluded capture for so long. They would describe a white man between the ages of 25 and 30, with a stocky build and reddish-brown hair that was worn in a crew cut. He would wear heavy rimmed glasses, not unlike the ones I'm wearing right now. No, I am not the Zodiac Killer. I wasn't born yet. And dark clothing, also not unlike what I'm wearing right now. I promise I'm not the Zodiac Killer. And this is the description of the Zodiac Killer that would be eventually sketched. Why do I kind of look like it? It's not me. It's not me, I swear. And the witnesses would last see the Zodiac Killer heading north on Cherry Street, but unfortunately dispatch miscommunicated the description given by the witnesses. It told responding officers that the suspect was a black male. How the do you have that up? Rather than a white male, obviously, perhaps confusing it with the dark clothing. And responding officers Donald Folk and Eric Zelms passed a man who very well could have been the Zodiac Killer on Jackson Street. But due to the inaccuracy of the information that was provided to them, they obviously never stopped him. They would only realize their mistake later when the correct description was given to them that they probably missed him by that much. And there was no trace as to where he could have gone after that. And the man that the officers saw appeared to be older than what the original witnesses described him as, being 25 to 30. They thought he was perhaps 35 to 45, so an updated sketch was drawn. And these subtle differences were shown side by side with the original drawing, not differing too much. And these are the closest images we have to the Zodiac Killer in the last 50 plus years. And when the crime scene was secured by police officers, they would find bloody fingerprints on the scene, perhaps missed by the Zodiac Killer when wiping it down in haste. And Stine would unfortunately be found deceased, slumped over the passenger side of the vehicle, with an arm dangling out the passenger door. And initially it wasn't known that this was an actual Zodiac Killer attack, and instead it was believed that this was probably just a taxi robbery gone wrong, because Stine's wallet and keys were missing when the body was found, and also what was missing would be a large section of Stine's shirt. Perhaps the part of his shirt was taken as a rag to wipe down the fingerprints, but alas, it was missing. But not for long. It would be found 2 days later, on October 13th, 1969. The San Francisco Chronicle would receive a letter from the Zodiac Killer.
Grammarly is starting to piss me off right now.
The missing portion of his shirt included. The letter taunted the police, saying that they could have caught the Zodiac Killer had they searched the park, which is such a slap in the face. Like, the letter said that they were more focused on who could make more noise rather than catching a killer, so basically just mocking them. He also threatened to kill a full school bus, saying he would shoot the front tire and quote-unquote pick off the kitties as they come bouncing out. Despite the description, the fingerprints, and the letters, there has still never been a confirmed identity of the Zodiac Killer. And as forensic technology has continued to advance, there has been continuing efforts to identify him, obviously. Though most of the modern attempts to solve this mystery are spearheaded by internet sleuths and people fixated on the case. Ever since the San Francisco Police Department decided to close the case back in 2004. Which brings us to the topic of today, which is my grandfather is the love of Zodiac Killer. Not me, it's just the name of the video that the TikTok guy came out with. So now that we have all of the Zodiac Killer information, let's get into the TikTok videos and claims.
You know, you'd think Grammarly would know how to just grammar, but apparently it just doesn't want to do what it's supposed to right now. Because usually whenever it's something like this, you can go in and it'll come up, but nope, it didn't want to do that.
The most prominent suspects in the Zodiac Killer case to date. His potential connection to the Zodiac began with the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside, California on October 30th, 1966.
Do what you're supposed to, do what you're supposed to. Come on.
Similar to the ones used for the anonymous confession letters in Alan's home. Triple whammy. And the letters regarding Bates contain symbols and signs that some experts say are linked to the
Deborah.
although definitive connections were never actually made. So it is all speculation and conspiracy, essentially. Alan had a very troubling history, though, that intersected eerily with the Zodiac's timeline. He was fired as a teacher for essaying multiple students and then moved back to his parents' home, just minutes from the site of the first Zodiac killings on Lake Herman Road in December of 1968. And this is interesting as well. Alan's brother gifted him a Zodiac watch in 1967, which bore the same circle cross symbol that the Zodiac killer used in his letters. And in the late 1960s, Alan allegedly told his friend Don Cheney about his desire to kill couples, taught the police with letters, and conveniently enough used the name Zodiac, which Cheney eventually reported to police. And these discussions involved using a flashlight to shoot at night, wearing disguises, and even writing a novel about these fantasies. Alan would be questioned by police multiple times, obviously, and became a primary suspect in the Zodiac case. And in 1971, he would be formally interviewed by the Vallejo Police Department and subjected to several search warrants over the years. And Alan would also...
Why won't it work?
Literally asking point blank if he was the Zodiac killer, which he would always deny.
Are you the Zodiac Killer? No, definitely not. No. I couldn't murder anyone.
And the physical evidence found during the searches of Alan's property would include a typewriter similar to the one the Zodiac used to write those letters, bomb diagrams, and letters threatening school children, which if we go back, we saw that letter about the kids in the school bus and how he would take all of them out as they
Deborah, stop.
To be honest, Alan would also have a shoe size of 10.5, which we saw in evidence earlier as well. There would also be matching prints found of Barry's privacy, and would own a knife similar to the one used in that attack as well. And there are also further connections made between Arthur and the Zodiac killer that led people to believe he was responsible as well. If you were to rearrange the symbols at the bottom of the letter the Zodiac wrote about the film The Exorcist, it spells Lee, Arthur's middle name, also mine, which I don't like. It's spelled differently though, so it's fine. I think that's strange, but I digress. And in the letters written about Cherry Bates, there was a strange-looking character at the bottom of the page, appearing like a Z, or Z for you Americans. But some say it's 32, because there's kind of like a 3 on top that goes into a 2. And the supposed link to Arthur Allen with the 32 is that he was 32 at the time that Cherry was killed, and lived at 32 Fresno Street in Vallejo, California. And the Zodiac cipher, wait for it, would also have 32 characters. But despite these circumstantial links, there was no concrete evidence to tie Allen directly to the Zodiac crimes. Handwriting and DNA tests would fail to conclusively match him to the Zodiac letters. And after he died in 1992, Allen's house would be searched again, and authorities would find intriguing items, but they would find no confession or definitive proof of guilt. Which, like, I don't know, you look at the handwriting and stuff, and it's like, they could have changed it. Why wouldn't you change it up a little bit? I can change my writing up pretty easily, man. Like, what kind of police work is that? I know it is, but still, it's just, I don't know. There's a lot of connections there. I know it's kind of like off with him, like, doing those things to children and then randomly family, like killing adults, and maybe his friend just wanted to be famous for knowing the Zodiac Killer and saying that he confessed to them and stuff. I'm not sure. There's a lot of weird coincidences, like circumstantial evidence. I'm not sure, but we'll get into the rest. So ultimately, while many elements of Alan's life and actions aligned with the Zodiac's crimes, the evidence remained inconclusive. And looking at the police report when Arthur Lee Allen was arrested for his crimes against children, it's clear he was a cooking monster. He would lure children into the bedroom of his trailer before performing SA acts on them, reportedly saying things like, "I know you don't like it, but I'm just a nasty man. I hope to God you're rotting in hell, you filthy, disgusting, nasty piece of shit." So obviously Arthur was a monster, but was he the monster? We don't know, but that brings us to our next suspect, Richard Gaikowski. Gaikowski would serve in the Army as a medic, learning skills that might have been utilized in the Zodiac's crimes, such as using torn clothes for bandages, homemade weapons, etc. This detail is one that links Gaikowski to the Zodiac tearing a piece of Paul Stein's shirt during that one attack, though in that instance the shirt wasn't necessarily used as a bandage. Instead, it was used to claim that murder later on. So Gaikowski would be arrested and would spend 38 hours in jail back in October of 1965 for refusing to sign a traffic citation. And he would do this while working at the Morning News Gazette, which was a local newspaper. Interesting. To write a story about the conditions of county jail from an inmate's perspective. And the circumstantial evidence is that during the time of this arrest, he lived 5 miles from the site of the first attack. So by 1969, Richard would be working for a different newspaper, The Good Times, Not So Good Times, which was basically an anti-establishment, anti-police, and often a pro-violence publication that had published diagrams to build bombs. Good times. And in January of 1969, he would publish a fictional story about a revolutionary group called the Berkeley Revolutionary Committee for Business, which engages and humiliates the combined police forces of the Bay Area of July 4th, 1969, the same day that the Zodiac's second attack would transpire. And the story also talks about police frantically searching suburban areas for bombs and booby traps. Good times is also found in the Zodiac's letters, though not used as a proper noun indicating a name, and more so referring to the Good Times. And further circumstantial evidence shows that the address for the Good Times switchboard was only a couple doors away from Paul Stein's address. Also, an article from the Good Times about donating books to the switchboard's address next to Stein's home is a shortened version of Richard Gaikowski's name to 4 letters, Gaik. And this is linked by some to a cipher by the Zodiac, which, when solved, is a letter about how the Zodiac will not reveal his name, with a similar sounding 4 letters, Gaik. And perhaps a more compelling piece of evidence would be that Nancy Slover, a police dispatcher who actually spoke with the Zodiac Killer when he called to reclaim the responsibility on July 4th, has identified the Zodiac's voice as Richard's.
Hi everybody, it's Nancy again. I'm back. I listened to the voice of Richard. I felt shocked and deja vu. In my opinion, he was the same person who I listened to in July of 1969.
And we, of course, don't actually have a recording of the call that Nancy had with the Zodiac Killer, but there is a recording of Gaikowski talking about code breaking in relation to the Zodiac's messages.
The whole thing about a code, you got to remember also what the code is. How the code is broken. You have never any way of knowing whether it's a real code or whether it's just a fake code. So what's happening? Well, it just means that sometimes, like the military and all of that, sometimes you send garbled messages and that's absolutely nothing. So that you get the enemy and all they're trying to break the code.
And you can compare that to when someone claiming to be the Zodiac called into a live broadcast talking about having headaches ever since he killed a kid and continued to kill children.
Okay.
Move!
The question that you driven yourself out of the sure that you haven't got down for the punishment. And my second, so I kill those kids.
And the voices don't really sound the same, meaning potentially one of the following is true. Richard isn't the Zodiac. The person that called the TV broadcast isn't the Zodiac. Or neither of them are the Zodiac. Just a lot of unanswered questions and frustration and creepy dudes. And whether or not you find enough evidence to pin Gaikowski to the Zodiac killings, investigators would never find enough to suspect him. So those are basically just two more interesting examples of people who are suspected to be the Zodiac killer, though the claims would never be verified and have not been verified. But there are, of course, other people who have had their name associated with the Zodiac, with some even being alleged in the past few years. Gary Francis Post, for example. Gary Francis Post was identified as a potential candidate for the Zodiac back in 2021, when Casebreakers, a group of former cops, forensic analysts, and private investigators specializing in cold cases came together. They claimed that the DNA obtained from a hiking match belonged to Post, bore strong similarities to the DNA recovered at the Zodiac crime scenes, as well as sharing a resemblance to the sketch drawings of the Zodiac. They also alleged that he had secretly been a suspect since 2016, and Thomas J. Colbert, the founder of Casebreakers, which I love, they're like the Avengers of cops, would be in an interview with Fox News.
My FBI guys say it's irrefutable. It's a match.
Though the FBI contact was never named, and the FBI has never confirmed the Post as an actual suspect, despite the claims that he secretly was. In fact, the FBI has even countered this claim by saying it's actually still open, and there's no new information. So much for the Avengers. There are also claims that Gary Francis Post trained a series of killers to whom he claimed was Zodiac. And this accusation that Gary is the Zodiac is even believed by Gary's former neighbor, who had been babysat by Gary and his wife. And this claim that Gary could potentially be the Zodiac killer essentially boils down to the fact that he had a scar on his head. Now, the Zodiac killer potentially had a scar on his head as well. And they also shared the same shoe size.
I looked up to Gary's Post as an uncle. I used to cut his hair. I spent nights in his house.
For others like Gwen, who grew up with Gary and his wife Mary babysitting her, after a revelation from a 2018 conversation, there's no question in her mind. Post is the man some suspect him to be.
Post would also live near the area of murders and own firearms as well. But in America, near San Francisco, I think if those are the criteria for guilt, there might be over 1,000 Zodiacs out there, probably more, probably tens of thousands of Zodiac killers out there. And on YouTube, there are videos attempting to debunk the idea that Post was the Zodiac at all. And one of them is a guy named David Gold saying that Gary couldn't have been the Zodiac because he knew guys who were the Zodiac.
You guys know that I'm telling you Frank Morse and the Anglin brothers were the Zodiac killers, because I knew them.
Alright. Strangely, it does seem that a lot of people claim to have known the Zodiac killer, and one such person took to TikTok to share that they were even related to the Zodiac killer. Potentially. Let's get into it. But first we'll start with my story. Field and I were just scrolling through our FYP on TikTok in the morning, as we do most mornings or nights, and this man comes across the TikTok, and his name is Jay Foy. And me, having not thought about the Zodiac since the movie had come out years and years previous, great movie, you should check it out, this man started to explain how he believes his own grandfather was the Zodiac killer. And that just tickled my fancy. It made the hairs on my neck stand up and my pores open up and my butthole. Needless to say, I was interested immediately.
My grandpa is the mother.
Nope, Joe, we're not home yet. Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, we're not home yet. Oh, that was Deborah. Fuck.